I've told this story twice in 30 years, and both times the person I told it to laughed. I don't hold it against them. I laughed too the first time. The second time I didn't because by then I'd read the field log. Relay Sark was the loneliest post I ever kept. Tidally locked rock at the outer edge of the SETHEK survey corridor, one hemisphere of perpetual GREY noon and one of permanent dark, and my station straddling the Terminator line because that was where the dish had the best sky. I was 32. I'd been there 11 months when the skiff came down. It didn't hail. That was the first odd thing. Every vessel that passed through the corridor ran the standard exchange, designation, intent, duration, and I'd log it, and that was the whole of it. This one came down clean out of the noon sky without a word on any channel, and landed 200 meters from my station in a flat stretch of gravel, and 4 figures climbed out and stood looking at me. They were tall, robed in something the COLOUR of old slate with hoods pushed back. They had faces that reminded me of deep water, not threatening, just patient in a way that implied a very long bottom. They stood in a row and they looked at me and they did not speak. I walked out to meet them because what else do you do? "Morning," I said. "You want coffee?" None of them answered. The one at the front, the oldest, I found out later he held a doctrinal rank that translated roughly as voice of listening, took a small book from inside his robe and wrote something in it. He wrote for a long time, considering what he was writing carefully, and then he looked up at me again. I asked where they'd come from. I asked about the skiff's drive configuration because the exhaust profile had been unusual. I told them the coffee was real, not reconstituted, standing arrangement with the supply tender. I said the wind picked up around the 14th hour, and if they were camping, they'd want to stake their gear. I mentioned I hadn't spoken to anyone in 6 weeks. The voice of listening wrote all of this down. They stayed 3 days. I learned later that the Vethaan Conclave had been sending survey teams to the edges of what they called the God's domain for 400 years, documenting the sacred quiet of the uninhabited frontier, the vast speaking silence of empty space. Relay Sark fell inside that boundary. They had come to log its silence the way a naturalist logs a species, carefully, reverently, with full doctrinal attention. In 400 years of surveys, they had never found anyone there. I cooked for them. I talked through every meal because silence at a table makes me uncomfortable, and I have never trained myself out of it. I explained the relay array's maintenance cycle in more detail than anyone has ever wanted. I told them about the supply tender pilot who did a credible impression of the sector administrator. I hummed while I worked. I don't always notice. And I gave the voice of listening a spare copy of my dish alignment log because he seemed interested and I had a duplicate. On the morning of the 3rd day, they walked back to their skiff. The voice of listening stopped at the foot of the ramp and turned and looked at me for a moment with those patient deep-water eyes, and then he inclined his head, not a bow, something smaller and more deliberate, and they left without a word. I filed a contact report. Unusual vessel type, 4 non-human individuals, apparent survey mission, non-hostile, no shared language established. 3 days of contact, 0 incidents. I noted they hadn't spoken and that I had no way of knowing whether that was protocol or physiology. 30 years passed. A diplomatic ATTACH acute found me through the Frontier Records office. She was young, serious, carrying a leather folio, and she sat across from me in my kitchen and explained that the Vethaan Conclave had recently opened archival exchange as part of the broader diplomatic framework, and that certain documents had been flagged as historically significant to the human contact record, and that my designation, RS-441, Relay Sark, appeared in one of them. She slid a translated page across the table. It was an excerpt from the field log of the voice of listening, filed with the Conclave's doctrinal archive in the months following the Sark survey. The translation was careful, with footnotes where the concepts didn't cross cleanly. I read it 3 times. He had written that the doctrine of sacred silence held that the divine communicated only through the absence of sound, that to speak in the domain of the God was to drown out what the God was saying. 4 centuries of survey work had confirmed this. The frontier was silent. The God's domain was quiet. The evidence was consistent and complete. At Relay Sark, he wrote, they had encountered a creature that never stopped making sound. It spoke continuously. It made sound while performing tasks that required no speech. It produced a low tonal repetition. I understood this was the humming, with no communicative function they could identify. It pressed a physical document into his hands as a gift. It appeared wholly unaware that it was standing in a place of sacred listening. And then the last line, which the ATTACHE acute had underlined lightly in pencil, the way you underline something you want someone to find. If the domain of the God is filled with such a voice, and the voice does not know it is speaking into silence, we have been wrong about what silence means. The ATTACHE acute asked me if I had any questions. I told her the coffee was real, not reconstituted, and I had a spare cup if she wanted one. She laughed I didn't.